This is an interview with Professor Micah Watson, a professor at Calvin University, where he helps lead the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program, and serves as Executive Director of the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics. He's also the co-author of Hopeful Realism, a book exploring natural law, democratic politics, and Christian public life. You can read more about Professor Watson on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy the interview.
Let's start off. Obviously, head of PPE at Calvin University, had one of the top people of the Henry Institute. And how about we start off with telling us how you got into philosophy, college, and then we'll talk more about Calvin University.
Sure. So unlike yourself, I was not as studious as I should have been in high school and college. You can't really tell this. You know this because we've met in person. I was sitting down. The video won't show that I'm fairly tall, at 6'8". And so I was mainly a basketball player in my own head. And so in high school and college, I was more of a jock, and I liked school fine, but I didn't take it seriously enough. And I went to UC Davis, California, and played basketball there. And I liked politics. I leaned conservative in my politics and on religious things, and at UC Davis was certainly not that. So I kind of enjoyed good spirited discussions, even though I was mainly thinking about basketball, but I enjoyed good spirited discussions about politics and different things. And after I graduated from college, I didn't quite know what to do with my life, so I moved to the mountains near Yosemite in California. I worked at a Christian camp there, which was great. I had a really good time doing that, but my mind got a little bored, and I thought, well, maybe I should look into, some kind of further schooling where I could take it more seriously. And I did, and I was fortunate enough to get into a program at Baylor, which studied church and state, kind of religion and politics. And I moved to Waco, Texas, and did that program and loved it. Had a great experience there, and then was blessed in applying to PhD programs to get into a really good program at Princeton and work with Robert George and some other great professors, and found out that I could do okay at this. So I got to spend several years arguing, talking, thinking, reading about ideas that matter, and felt very fortunate to be able to do that.
That's awesome. So obviously, like you said, you lean more conservative at UC Davis, and then you worked your way to Baylor and then Princeton. How do you think the journey from going through all those colleges and then going from to focusing on church and state, and then almost like theology and philosophy into Princeton for your PhD, how did that journey shape your political and philosophical worldview? Like, did it change at all from when playing basketball at UC Davis and then PhD with Professor George at Princeton? I think that's really great. Also, we're gonna have him on soon.
Oh, very good.
Yes, so that would be very cool. Yeah. So how did the journey shape your philosophical worldview and political worldview?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I have to kind of tell too long a story about that. I think so. What I had to figure out first, just in terms of what I believed and what I thought, I had to categorize, or at least prioritize those different commitments that I thought were true, or principles that I thought were true. And one of the things I liked about school is it gave me the chance to really explore. I grew up in a house that was very full of faith. My dad was a pastor, my mom was a teacher, and so I certainly had a Christian identity that was passed on to me. And while I was really in high school, I started to think, is this really mine, or is this something I just inherited from my parents? And I kind of had to think through some of those things. And so I'd say the first thing is, I think what we believe about the world to be true, what we believe about the big questions about God, about human beings, about what we are, those are the things that were foundational for me, and we're religious in nature. And then out of that, I think flow some things about politics, some things about culture, some things about morality. And I guess my educational journey certainly confirmed for me some of those foundational beliefs I already had. Some people get to a secular school or to get to grad school, whatever, and they are confronted with different ideas that are contrary or sometimes even hostile to faith. and they can lose their faith. I found the contrary. I really enjoyed those conversations. I enjoyed wrestling with people who were very smart but thought differently than me. It really confirmed some of the things I thought was already true. At the same time, it did broaden my views. So I spent a semester in DC in 1994, so a long time ago, and I worked with a number of people who were very poor, who looked different than me in terms of ethnicity, had different backgrounds. And I think that actually helped my approach to politics as well. I was conservative. It actually helped me see, okay, this is why people have some different thoughts about the government's role with politics and how people can be helped and how the economy works. So I would say that my educational journey helped both ground some of the things I already believe, but also broadened some of my beliefs. And being at Princeton in particular, working with Professor George, who of course is one of the world's great thinkers, and he won't say that, of course, but he's really good at being able to categorize things and go deep. But he's also really good at interacting with people who think differently than him. And his recent kind of tour with Cornell West, where they go and they do these different events, kind of showcases that. So in my very much more humble way, I think I've learned, one, dig down deep, find out what you believe, explore that. Don't be afraid to mix it up with other beliefs, and be open to learning from other beliefs. And those two things together, be grounded but also open. I'd say that's probably the most important part of what I learned from my journey from, mainly basketball player at UC Davis to more serious student at Baylor, and then really, I think, hitting my stride a little bit better at Princeton.
Yeah. Yeah, I've shared a similar experience being more conservative Christian in DC with all people from all over, all perspectives. Some things I've never even heard before, I've heard while I've been here. And I guess something that I think is really important is not losing that faith going into college and especially with secular university, you have so many things on your mind. Sometimes faith just gets, pushed away. Maybe you'll look back at it when you graduate. But something that I specifically maybe have struggled with, and I know a few of my peers have, is how do you maintain that and also argue it in a way that is respectful for people who are, might be like, oh, why do you believe this? Or, I think it's actually more so like, why do you believe this? And then it's almost a personal examination of your faith where you're like, oh, we hear all these things on social media. I had a friend yesterday. I had a religious debate with him. He is Hindu. And it's kind of, where do you think we could go for resources to defend our faith, specifically, I guess, for Christians? And then how do you see college students losing or gaining faith and being able to protect it nowadays?
Yeah. So one of the things I know about you, Dominic, is you've already been working on this because you've gone to things like the Witherspoon programming and things like that. So I'd want to highlight places like the Witherspoon Institute that put on educational programs for high school students and college students. And one of the things that's great about that week, and I know you've done other things too, but you're not only doing some of the reading and the thinking and the discussing, you're also hanging out and making friends with like-minded other young men or other young women for the women's course. And so I guess what I would want to say for students who are thinking about going to college, it is a balance. You certainly want to be open to new ideas, but you also want to stick with your convictions and stick with the faith that has been passed on to you. And I think part of what we have to recognize is we are fully orbed beings. We're not just classroom people. The classroom is really important. I'm a professor. I'm going to emphasize that, of course. But we're also people who really need friends. We need a community. We need people that are younger than us that we can kind of invest in. And then we need ourselves also to be open to older folks who have wisdom who can invest in us, right? So I think one thing that's really important for college or for high school students going to college students, are you part of for Christians in particular, I'll speak to that, to be part of a local church. There will be college age ministries that are available, and that's great. But you're really meant to be with people who aren't just your own age. So being in a local church, getting plugged in, volunteering, doing something. One of the traps of college students is everything is so catered to the college student's experience. And rightly so. We want to invest in our college students, but we also want college students to invest outward as well, right? So are you getting involved in the local church? And then I think friendship is just crucially important. I once was in high school. I had a couple of really good friends. They weren't believers, and I spent a ton of time. And my dad finally wrote me and said, "Look, it's great that you're friends with these guys, but do you have any friends who believe that what you do on the most important things?" And being a basketball player, he used this language. He said, "Being double teamed in basketball it's tough to succeed. It's also tough to succeed if you're being double teamed in friendship." So I think being intentional about, certainly have friends who don't think like you. That's great. It's fine. But make sure you have some brothers or sisters, brothers and sisters, who do believe what you believe and are going to hold you accountable. And you can hold them accountable. And so that'd be my counsel. In terms of, you mentioned where to look for resources. We are really living in an age where young believers, faithful people, have just a wealth of resources. There are things that talk about all sorts of different issues in terms of how the faith plays out in morality. There's great books and figures. People like C.S. Lewis is one of my favorites, who I'd recommend. There are great, for folks who are Catholic, there are awesome Catholic apologists. Peter Kreeft is one who actually graduated from Calvin. He was a Protestant at that point and became Catholic. He's a great resource. I would say both of those thinkers, Lewis and Kreeft, would be valuable for Christians across the board, not just for Catholics or Protestants. And then there are groups and clubs, communities that do apologetics. If you're really into apologetics and that sort of thing, then you can find your people. So I would look for those resources. I'd look for older folks who are having those conversations and ask them, just like you've asked me about that. And then I would find places of community where people are talking about this. So it's great you're talking with a friend who's Hindu or Hindi. And in college, you're going to run into folks who are secular or atheist, or they might be Muslim. There's some great things we have in common with those different traditions, and then there are some things that are different. And it's actually a good thing to run into someone of another faith who believes strongly enough where you can have a really good, spirited but respectful conversation. It's going to help you, and with God's help, it can help them as well. So.
Great. And now, yeah, I actually think that the Witherspoon Institute, to plug them, I guess, real quick, I think they do a really great job with that. And definitely, I've held on to friends who, to this day, was also doing the John Witherspoon Fellows, that keeping in contact with them has been really great. But pivoting to Calvin University, because obviously not a secular university,
True.
how does the Christian mission of Calvin shape the way that PPE approaches politics, philosophy, and economics differently from secular programs?
Yeah, great question. Well, so you mentioned PPE. I'm involved in that here. PPE is a combination of the three disciplines that got started in Oxford in the 1920s. So it's about 100 years old. The disciplines themselves are far older than that. You go back to Aristotle and ancient philosophers, but the combination of them into a modern major is fairly recent, and it's meant for students who don't want to be tied down to just one discipline. And so if you go PPE, you are drawing from the tools that philosophy can give you, and the tools that economic thinking can give you, and the tools that political science or politics can give you, and they really complement each other. So sometimes I love my philosopher friends, but philosophy sometimes can get too much in a castle in the air, and we're spending the whole time talking about these intricate features of what true justice, ideal justice looks like. We want to ask, well, how do we know if we're actually achieving that in the real world? How do we test it? And that's where social science and political science can come in and help that. My economist friends, economics is such a great discipline about human choice and about how we make decisions and what's valuable. And there's certain lessons that I think are, have been pretty well established by our economist friends. But if you ask, hey, should we put human kidneys on the market? That's a philosophical question. That's where economics needs, I think, philosophy to come in, and they need each other, and poli-sci as well. So I think it's a great discipline. Now, you asked about Calvin's Christian identity. When we're talking about human behavior and human choice and what's valuable, those are questions that have a deep root, whether it's recognized or not. They go deeper than any of these. Just really go into what we believe about the human being, what we believe about who we are. And at Calvin, as with any genuinely Christian college, we're in the Reformed Protestant tradition. But this would be true of our Catholic friends as well, and Orthodox and Baptist and Methodist and the whole. We believe that human beings are made in the image of God. And so there's an inherent dignity and value to the human being that would ground how we would approach these questions about the economy, about law, about philosophy, and that any approach to justice in the public square, any approach to public policy is going to want to take that into account in the sort of creatures we are, and what human flourishing looks like. There are some places, secular schools, that can be very good schools, do good things, but they can almost have a division between those questions about who we are as human beings that they might see as value laden or philosophical, and then public policy, as if that can be separate. We think the human being is an integrated whole. We are moral, we are religious, we're rational, we're emotive, we're a complex kind of creature, and any approach to what justice or human flourishing looks like that tries to seal off those questions from each other is going to be impoverished. So at Calvin, we take that seriously, and we also take seriously the idea that God has made some things known to us, and that we do well to listen to that and think about how those things would impact the public square.
Yeah, that's very, very cool, the intersection of faith into the PPE program. I think that's it's very, very cool. And just looking at PPE itself, what kind of careers or paths do PPE graduates typically go into?
Yeah, so great question. One of the nice things about PPE, it is broad, right? So you're learning these 3 different disciplines. And I mentioned it got started in Oxford. So the Anglosphere, the places where the British Empire went and had footprints around the world, you see PPE degrees more so than in the U.S. But in the U.S., it's catching up. We have a lot of programs at smaller universities like Calvin to big places like Penn or Arizona State or North Carolina. We have hundreds of PPE majors. And so we're still seeing where those majors are going. So a few areas, journalism. With PPE, you're learning about how to use these different tools to approach lots of different issues. And for a journalist, that's going to be something that would be really helpful, because journalists have to kind of become little experts in lots of different things and be nimble that way. Law. I have a lot of students that will go on to law school. PPE is a great foundation for thinking about law. We've been mentioning public policy. Public policy is a good one. Education. The education on the university level, the high school level, and then government work itself. So I've had several students who have gone on to working either with a government agency or sometimes with an NGO that'll be interacting with government and government agencies. And then business. Business is another area. You think about how much intertwining there is between government policy and government agencies and business. We can debate whether that's a good thing or bad thing, and folks who are more libertarian will be critical, and folks who aren't will like that. But however you think about it normatively, having a sense of how these different systems interact really can give you a leg up if you're going to go into business as well. So there's a number of things there where our students have gone on to and had great careers. The other thing, and this is kind of a liberal arts talking point, but I don't mind repeating it, is the sort of thinking that you do with PPE. You are interacting with philosophy, you are interacting with social science, and you're doing some quantitative work. You're interacting with literature and how to read and assess. Those are skills that translate really well to lots of different fields. So those fields I mentioned are pretty typical. You'll get some very creative uses of a PPE degree in other fields too.
Yeah, PPE with specifically philosophy. I feel like a lot of people will sidestep philosophy into politics, and I know a lot of people, specifically myself, when I first looked at some PPE programs and then looked at just philosophy, I'm like, philosophy, what's the job outcome for philosophy? But I think PPE programs make it possible, so you have a little bit of everything. And then going into philosophy, we read the classics a lot: Aristotle, Plato. Obviously learn about Socrates, and I've been seeing especially a lot in high schools how we don't read any of the classics anymore. Maybe in private schools that's different. Public school is completely gone from it. Why do the classics matter in understanding humanity? because we have all these now modern day philosophers or self-proclaimed philosophers online talking about, how you should live your life, or referencing some classical ideas, but then bringing in some more secular ones. Why do the classics matter in the foundations that they bring in philosophy and into our lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're right that we have seen a diminishment of the classics in a number of schools. The common refrain is, what are you going to do with that kind of thing? On the plus side, I think there has been a renaissance of reading the classics in classical Christian schooling and classical schools, whether Christian or not, and then some homeschooling things as well. So there are some encouraging signs there, even though I think on the whole, our culture has sadly moved away from those things. Now we'll see. It may be interesting this summer when Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey comes out, which I think will be a pretty massive cultural event if that might, reignite some interest in the classics. So why are the classics important? I think what has to say is the question of who we are important. What does it mean to be human? How did we get to where we're at? What does it mean for us to live well? And if those are important questions, and I think they are self-evidently important, I think people will, there are some cynics who just say, well, no, nothing matters. They're nihilistic. I think most people aren't like that. Most people recognize that human beings matter, where we come from matters, the story we're a part of matters. And so the classics are important because they are the origin story of who we are. So you think about, Dominic, from us having talked a little bit before, I love movies, I love stories, I love the classics too, but with some superheroes, there's the origin story film that tells where the person comes from and how they get their powers and that sort of thing. And really the classics are the origin story for the tradition that those in the United States and other places in what we think of as the West have found ourselves. And we think about the thinkers and the writers and the practices they had coming out of places like Athens, coming out of Jerusalem, coming out of the Roman Empire, all those ideas. And then for the United States, kind of streamed through the British experience in a lot of ways. Not to say there aren't other influences as well, but for us to know where we stand now, it helps to know where the folks who came before us stood before. And even to criticize aspects of the Western tradition, we have to know what it is, right? We'd have to be able to be able to say, well, we can talk about what home looks like, what travel looks like. And the Odyssey is a great text that talks about trying to get home and why home is so important, but also why exploring is so important. And that's something that is important to us as human beings. Particularly in the United States, think about the urge to go west, to go explore, the idea of the frontier. Those have deep roots in the classics that you're talking about. So the short answer is they help us understand what it means for us to be human, what it means for us to live well, and then related, what it means for us to live well with those that we live with who may not share all of our convictions. I think the classics help us grapple with those questions too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think the classics are actually really interesting. They're not just some old guys from a while ago with some irrelevant knowledge. No, it really is important. And you talked about how it kind of founded this Western thought, which, I mean, if you look at the United States historically, the Western traditions that have influenced, like Greco-Roman texts, even especially like the Bible and Judeo-Christian values.
Right.
I think we are losing those traditions. My question to you is, are we losing those traditions? And then why? Why are we losing those foundations that, you see obviously less and less and more secular, and we continue to move away from that? And I'll ask in a later question about how we can change that or how it's impacting us. But are we losing those traditions and why?
I think the data shows with survey data and just anecdotally we see it too, that yes, as a culture we are becoming less and less traditionally religious. Now I think people are religious no matter what. They'll substitute something different for what used to be what was religious for them. So we see that anecdotally. When I was, when I lived in certain places, there would not be soccer games scheduled for Sunday mornings because Sunday mornings people wouldn't go; they'd be going to church. Well, we now schedule all sorts of things for Sunday mornings, and Christians and who want to keep the Sabbath special have to wrestle with what that looks like. We also see it in survey data with the rise of the nuns, the NONES, not our Catholic sisters who take a vow to God, but the nuns who answer, what religious are you? They say they put none and they don't put an identity. So that's risen. So I think it's definitely the case that we have lost some of that inheritance. But such things are rarely just going straight down or straight up, right? So I would not agree. There are some doom and gloom folks who just think that we are kind of just catastrophically losing the cultural relevance of faith, and I don't know if that's the case. The United States has been characterized at times by having great awakenings. Now, this gets maybe to what you were going to ask before. So what do we do about this? Well, human beings can't engineer great awakenings. If you're a Christian, you believe that that's really that's in God's timing and the Holy Spirit, and God works in mysterious ways, as the cliche goes. There are hopeful signs throughout this country of people rediscovering faith. And I think that the religious person, we do the best that we can in the little pocket of the world that God has placed us in to keep alive the faith, to keep alive the influence of Scripture, the practices we have, the children that we're going to raise. Now, on a lot of factors, the odds look really stacked against us. And as you mentioned, things do look like we are losing this inheritance, and that may be the case. There's no guarantee, right, that a religious identity will remain. Augustine grew up in Christian North Africa. And if we look at North Africa now, it is it's anything but Christian. So God doesn't guarantee, and he guarantees that the gates of hell will not overcome his church. So we can trust in that. But where that church flourishes and when, it seems like that's above our pay grade. So I do, to answer your question, I do think that we are losing that, but I do think there are also there are signs of hope. There are little pockets of revitalization, and hope for Christians is a theological virtue. We can pray and we can do our best to be faithful, and we can see what God will do with that.
All right. Yes. And then why are we losing this? Like, what are the driving factors? Yes, I do see that there are, I've seen studies of growing number of young Catholics. I've seen growing number of Christians and non-denominational churches. What is causing this seemingly like that there is, institutions specifically aren't adhering to, like soccer games. They're not going to be, they'll be scheduled for Sunday morning. Yeah. Or other such events where they won't even really go to a religion area at all because it could offend somebody, which I'm sure can make sense from a business standpoint. But why do you think our society has become more secularized? What do you think was one of the driving factors from early 20th century, maybe before or maybe even after that you've seen that has kind of pushed the U.S. towards a lot more secularism?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a huge question, and I'm just going to spitball here, and you can tell me if it makes any sense or not. I don't claim to have the grand answer to this. I do think some factors that have fed our secularization. One would be material wealth and success. We are living, it's just a really interesting dichotomy between the objective amount of wealth and resources that particularly people living in the United States have relative to other generations in history. We are, by most measures, incredibly well-to-do. It shouldn't say there aren't areas to work on or people with problems. There are. And at the same time, our levels of anxiety and unhappiness and discontent and other markers of unhappiness, like suicide, things like that, are quite troubling. I think there's a, there can be, you can argue there's a linkage between if we have lots of material success, well, maybe we don't think we need God as much anymore, right? And you have a generation, the World War II generation that sacrificed an incredible amount to win that war, to get through the Depression, and those folks saw a lot of hard things and lived through some hard things. And then in the 1950s and 60s, the United States, as the only industrialized country that survives World War II with its industries unscathed, right? These other countries got bombed to smithereens. We had an enormous part of the world's GDP and just were very well to do. And I think it's easy to get comfortable and think, well, what do we need? What do we need God for if we're doing so well with producing wealth? And you can kind of you can get very comfortable. So I think that's one thing. I also think if we think about liberalism, and I don't mean here like liberal versus conservative, like I'm forgetting the congresswoman's name, AOC liberal. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean liberalism as an approach to government that emphasizes the liberty of the individual and a safe playing field for society in which people can pursue their own desires and success. Liberalism's kind of a weak sauce as an aspiration for life, right? We think about the classics. So this is where the example of Achilles, who I'm not claiming as a great moral exemplar by any means, but when he's given the choice, you can either live a comfortable life and no one will ever heard of you, or you can live a life of glory, but you're going to die young. His aristocratic mindset and glory mindset is, I'm going to go for the gusto and just and I'll die young, but everyone will know who I am. Our mindset is more, well, I want to live the American dream. I want to live a little bit more comfortable. I want to get a bigger house than my parents had. I want to be able to retire at 55 and play golf the rest of my life. None of those are bad things, mm-hmm. but I don't think they satisfy the deepest longings in our heart as to what a good life looks like or what a heroic life looks like. So that's why I think we see a lot of young people kind of, well, this liberalism thing just seems kind of shallow. Isn't there more to life than that? And so we see more young men, some of them turning to faith, which is great. Some of them turning to some pretty toxic choices and on the alt-right, because the alt-right's they're giving them a story, they're giving them an identity, they're giving them something that's more deep than just, hey, I want to get the nicer car. So I think that's also part of where secularism has well, maybe that's actually why faith isn't being stamped out. Actually, now maybe we're confusing things. You asked why secularism is growing. I guess I would go back to I do think it's comfort, and I do think it's the other thing is we can see as a measure of this is people having fewer children as a marker of this, because children kind of can get in the way of comforts and plans, and they're seen as expensive. Our birth rate, we just had a report come out a couple days ago that's the lowest it's ever been. That's a symptom more than a cause, but it's a cause, or it's a symptom that's turning into its own cause. That the fewer children we have, the more self-focused we'll be, and that I think also can contribute to secularism, because faith does demand things of you. It makes you get up on Sunday mornings. It will tell you, hey, you might want A, B, or C, but you should not have them because they're not good for you, or too much isn't good for you. So I'll conclude my rambling answer here. You got me rambling. Was saying that the real rebellion of human beings against God is we want to be our own kind of gods, right? And the more success materially we have, the more freedom we have, perhaps the more likely we are to say, God, I don't necessarily want to say you don't exist, but I don't necessarily want you super involved with my day to day. I want to kind of do that on my own, a kind of functional secularism, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I definitely seen materialism is a big one in making other things their God. Is that kind of what you mean? Everybody has their own religion about what they worship or what they dedicate their lives towards, or did I get that wrong?
No, I think that's right. So I think people are, there are different ways of describing what kind of creatures we are. We're rational creatures. We use speech. Those are things that distinguish us from the animals. But I do think we order our lives where we worship something. So I'll make a confession here. Some of your listeners may find scandalous, but I went to a Taylor Swift concert with one of my daughters and enjoyed doing that with my daughter, but also was struck while I was there was just how much this looked like kind of a worship service. And there were liturgies, and there were words, and there were, if you were to compare the elements of of what someone believes in with some of the behavior and activities and emotions that I saw at this concert. And just to be fair, I could say the same thing about going to a Michigan State, Michigan football game, that maybe codes differently for gender, right? Or an NFL game. So, I think we're worshiping creatures. I think there's a Bob Dylan song that says you've got to serve somebody. You're going to make something the number one thing in your life. And the question is, what is that? And too often we make it ourselves. But from the Christian perspective, there's really only one person who can fill that and be the legitimate object of our worship, and that's God. When we try to put something else in there, it might be satisfying in the short term, but ultimately it's going to let us down.
Yeah. Another thing you said was that people who are, feeding into this more liberalism mindset, specifically of, for kids, having kids being it gets in the way of, your life, what you want to do, goals, aspirations, whatever it may be. Do you see, I've seen the argument or the idea that these people who believe in this liberalism mindset, not having kids hurts the liberalism movement because they're not having kids to pass that down? Or do you see that it's ingrained enough where we wouldn't really see much of a change, and that the families who have sort of that religion, more traditional mindset that are having kids, do you think the groups having kids and their ideas will impact specifically the United States anytime soon? Or do you think it's kind of minimal that will happen?
No, I think the demographic question is not just for the United States, it's global. And there is an argument that the groups that are having more kids, so think about certain strains of Orthodox Judaism, our friends in the Latter-day Saint church, many Catholic families, many Protestant families, over time, just in terms of how the demographic is going to work, that will have an impact in the religious identity of the nation or the community in the years to come, unless those kids get converted or captured by other ideologies when they go off to college or when they encounter different ideas or different approaches to life. It's not just, there's a cultural aspect to it, but you mentioned folks who are more progressive or liberal. For them, it's a really interesting question, because for the most part, those people want to see a very large role for government involved in rectifying inequalities and making sure everyone has a fair start, and trying to smooth out the discrepancies that can arise with any society, but particularly free market societies. Well, what that means, if you're going to do that, then your government's going to need to be pretty robust and have a robust tax base to draw from to pay for those kinds of programs. But if your population is shrinking, right, then eventually your population is going to look like this, like an upside down pyramid, where you have not very many people coming up through the ranks and a lot of people in the middle, and then a lot of old people, particularly as medicine gets better, people live longer. You have fewer and fewer people who are going to be working to provide the tax base to pay for government programs that progressives tend to like. So I've said, progressive folks, in the sense that they want a bigger government, need to be pro-natalist. They should be arguing for people to have lots of babies, because otherwise their hopes for what the government's going to do is going to fall apart. But I think it's even broader than that. So the countries like in Spain and Italy, South Korea, I think is at 0.78 kids per woman. And what you need to just stay level at population wise, apart from immigration, is 2.1, an average of 2.1 children per woman who can have kids. So once you get below 1, you're talking about having that population every generation, and that's why I think it's a massive public policy problem that even folks who have no religious stake in it are taking seriously. I do think that secularism feeds that, because if you're a secular person, you think this life's all I've got, right? This life's all I've got. I don't believe in an afterlife, and so I've got to make the most of my time now. And kids are cute, and they may bring this or that or the other, but they take a ton of time, the thinking goes. And I'm taking the most productive and youthful years of my life, and I'm staying up all night, and I'm changing diapers, and there's a sick kid, and it's a lot easier not to deal with that if this life's all we have. If you're a person of faith, then I think having children is a sign of hope. and it's a sign of a commitment to something, to passing on something bigger than yourself, and a tradition that will live on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very interesting to see, people talking about. So I've seen this as a thing of like, is there a strategy to having children in politics? Which I thought was, I think, kind of crazy to be just for politics. But yeah, Latter-day Saint groups. There's a girl here from Utah who has seven brothers, and she's the only girl.
Yeah.
I mean, having these large families, obviously very helpful in keeping a community, and then the dependency ratio problem. I know that's didn't that happen it happened in China with the one child policy. It kind of screwed the results for, especially if you want, I don't even know if they have Social Security there, but you need a certain amount of workers to pay for your Social Security, for all the social programs.
Right.
And if you don't have that, like what you said with more liberal policies, if you are, liberal in the United States and you're not having kids to have those ideas for you, then you're then how are you going to have that base of people? I think that's really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, I would. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I have nothing.
Well, I have to say, I think you were right you raised an eyebrow at the idea that we'd want to have kids for politics. I certainly we want to be careful not to instrumentalize having kids for a particular policy. It's like my wife and I, we have 5 kids, and people say, oh, you have enough for a basketball team. It'd be really silly for us to have wanted to have 5 kids just so we can have a basketball team, right? Now, now at the same time, if you're looking at things from a macro, country level or global level, the number of kids that people are having does have those political and economic outcomes that you're talking about. So it does matter. Like, do your policies make it easier or harder for people to raise a family? And so the politics angle, you do have to take care of or think about that. But yeah, we wouldn't want to say, gosh, the only reason I want to bring these little critters into the world is because it's going to raise GDP. That seems rather backwards. Yeah. The whole point of GDP is it's a measure of how well can these little critters live a flourishing life. So we want to make sure, like you've intimated, we keep the human flourishing. The human is what matters, and the policies and the politics, those are important, but they're important for the sake of people living well. We don't want to bring people in the world for the sake of the policy itself.
Yes, no, definitely. That wouldn't be having kids just so, your political party does well. Probably not the
best. Hey, son or daughter, we brought you into the world so you can help, Barack Obama or Joe Biden or Donald Trump. That's people can disagree about what the purpose of life is or the aspirational things that's probably not a good one. So.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about one of your books, Hopeful Realism.
Yeah, sure.
And I read some excerpts from it, and I had a question. So Hopeful Realism explores evangelical natural law in democratic politics. How do you see that framework holding up in today's political climate?
Well, I guess a couple of different ways I could answer that depending on what you mean by holding up. So I say I'm a co-author. I co-wrote that book with a couple of friends. One's a professor at Wheaton College in Illinois, and the other at Westmont College out in California. And we draw on the Bible. We draw on thinkers like Augustine and others, and we think that the principles that we are trying to articulate, we don't think we made them up. We think that they are kind of embedded in reality, that God created them. So in that sense, I think they'll hold up very well because I think they're true. But that's a different question than how might they be received, and I think that might be what you mean. Like how well might our ideas in hopeful realism be accepted? And obviously as authors, we try to write it in a way. Our audience really is fellow Christians, and particularly fellow Protestants. Our Catholic friends, we hope, will find the book interesting. The natural law is a doctrine that's very alive and well in the Catholic Church. We believe that evangelical Protestants need more attention paid to natural law, and we're hopeful, not to pun on the title of the book, but we're hopeful that evangelical Protestants will see that natural law is an idea that is consistent with Scripture. It's not a competitor to Scripture. Actually, if we look at the Bible, you can see natural law there, that the Bible testifies to the reality of a moral blueprint that God has created us with, that Christians can certainly see, but even non-Christians can access that. And there are some signs that among that audience, among evangelical Protestants, some people are finding our book helpful. We can't, we can do our best to try and get it out there and do talks and interviews like this, and the like, and then see what happens. But so we've seen some modest interest. What we're trying to figure out is, how do we platform it or scaffold it, if you like, where the ideas are accessible for people in churches. That's really what we're wrestling with recently. But no, I'm grateful you asked about it. It's been out for a year and a couple months, and we're still going around giving talks on it and hoping it'll catch fire a little bit.
Yeah. I remember when right before I came to the Witherspoon program in the summer, I looked up you and Professor Sna on YouTube, and I found an interview of you talking about hopeful realism. And I went back to that, and it really is interesting. For some people who are listening and watching who don't know what natural law is, could you give them a quick little, summary of what natural law is?
Yeah. So let me give you a pop culture version first.
Right.
If any of your viewers are familiar with Pixar, you think of Toy Story, but the movie here is Cars. And when you think about the universe of Cars, if they've seen that, the premise here is that these different cars are actually kind of like human beings. They're people with feelings and actions and a sort of nature. And those characters like Mater, and I should remember all these different character names, but Mater, the truck, is one of them. And then you have these different characters. They would be able to figure out what's good for them as the sort of creatures they are, even apart from the owner's manual of the car, right? So the car will come, or the truck will come with an owner's manual. It'll lay things out that's really helpful and good. But you could also figure out, even without that putting milk in the gas tank is going to be really bad for that car flourishing as cars are supposed to do. That driving over broken glass and crashing into walls is not going to help that car flourish as the car is supposed to do. In other words, there's a nature to what it looks like for a car in that universe, even cars we have, to do what they're supposed to do. And some behaviors further that flourishing, and others just destroy it. Okay. And similarly, human beings, natural law, the idea of natural law is we have a nature. There's a way that nature flourishes, a way people live well, and there's a way such that we can harm or diminish what our flourishing looks like. And so the first idea is that there is a sort of blueprint for what it looks like to live well. And we can say that with some confidence, just like we can say that someone's body is healthy, and we can also look at someone who is struggling with a disease and they're really struggling that body is not healthy. So the first idea is that there's a blueprint for what it looks like for human beings to live well. And the second is that we can know it just by being human beings, right? So from the Christian point of view, of course, we want to emphasize the Bible is like the owner's manual for the car, that God has given us direction as to how to live. But we also believe, the Christian natural law person also believes, that God has made every human being in his image. And because of that, even folks without the Bible can know they should honor their parents, can know that sexual assault is wrong, can know that we should take care of the environment. We shouldn't be dumping toxic waste in our rivers, right? And that doesn't mean it's the same level as the Bible, but it's still important that they can know some level of what it means to live well. So just to recap, two things: there's a moral blueprint for human flourishing, and we can know it. And I think those are the two bedrock ideas of what natural law teaches. Now, it gets way more complicated when you get into the details, so I don't want to sell it off as being, just those two things, but those are the two bedrock ideas. And then how that works is where you get books about natural law from folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for that, especially the analogy. Cars, great movie. Trilogy. I didn't even know that there was a Cars 3, but
I didn't
yeah.
either.
Yeah, no, Yeah, three Cars movies, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And having sort of the shared natural law idea, I think in secular society is very, very awesome. And
Well, and one of the nice, if you're talking with a secular person who's really dubious, a great intro that you use Cars as well, but Martin Luther King Jr. is someone very religious, devout Christian, as all of us had his failings. But in his letter from Birmingham jail, he explicitly brings in natural law and quotes Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And so a lot of secular folks may not be open to Aquinas or Christianity, but they tend to respect Martin Luther King Jr. So it's a great entry point to the idea of natural law, as Martin Luther King Jr. takes that idea and applies it to the injustice of segregation. That you can know that segregation is wrong. That goes against the blueprint of human flourishing.
yeah, great. Yeah, I that's awesome. I actually did not know that. So letter to in Birmingham jail, right?
Letter from a Birmingham jail. Yeah. So when he got arrested for not having the right marching permit, and while in prison, he wrote this just incredible letter to 7 clergymen that he thought were being a little too moderate on the question. So I think it's a modern classic. We talked about the classics before. Letter from Birmingham jail is a modern classic for American thought and I think Christian thought too.
Yes. So as I would say you're pretty devout Christian. Looking at there's a large argument of people, especially now, and I can say this with specifically a lot of high schoolers who disregard the idea of religion because of science. And it's this science versus religion clash that for them in their, in empirical, reasonable mind, God's does not make sense to them, or that they rule out God. They just say, oh, because of science.
Yeah.
How do you take in science and Christianity, or science and religion, and what would you give as some tips to be like, well, no, they actually don't clash?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my question to you.
Yeah, so a good question. I think all these sort of things might depend on how well you know the person. If you're just meeting someone and having this conversation, you got to step a little carefully because you don't know them. Where if I know someone well and they give me that sort of answer, I say, you're a better thinker than that. You're a better thinker than that. Just like I would not accept the Christian who says, well, God said it, so that's all I need to know. Well, that's just a really simplistic approach from a Christian person. And I would say this is the secular version of that. And I would acknowledge that there are some real questions that Christianity has to answer, and there are some good objections, but this is not one of them. It's kind of, if I know the person well, that's where I'm starting. Science, the history of science shows is actually most of the early scientists did believe in God, and it makes sense because they believed in an orderly universe that would be amenable to investigation. That if the universe has a sort of order to it that was authored, then we would expect to be able to explore and conduct scientific experiments, and we'd be able to do all these things and figure out some things about how the world works. So part of my response, I think, and I should say, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a historian of science, so I'm just speaking as a layperson here. But the history of science shows that there's certainly, with some of the earliest great scientists, there's not a necessary tension between faith and science. Now, there's historically some conflicts, so one should acknowledge that. I would mention, Ross Douthat has a recent book called Believe. He's a New York Times columnist, and he goes into some of the ways that modern science has actually increased the plausibility of a creator, of a God. And again, I'm not qualified to get into the nitty gritty of that, but there are some things about just the most recent sort of things with physics and with quarks and all these very strange things that at least give as much reason to think there might be a designer than that there wasn't, or that there isn't. So I guess that's how I'd also say, in some ways, science itself to think that science can disprove the existence of God is something of a category mistake. Science is about what we can observe and replicate, what we can, and what others can come after us and kind of test as well. And the proposition that God exists, and God is taken by most religious people to be an immaterial being, is just a category mistake to think that science has the tools to be able to answer that particular question. And so in that respect, I think it's something of a category mistake. And there are a lot of great Christian scientists and other theistic scientists who have discovered, so Francis Collins, somewhat controversial among some because of his role during the COVID thing, but was an evangelical Christian, came to faith in part through the works of C.S. Lewis, was intimately involved, I think led the DNA sequencing. I forget the exact name of this. The bio, what was it? Anyway, he was involved very, very much as a scientist with our DNA and figuring all that out, and as a very devout believer. So there's examples of Christians who are good scientists. There are a lot of scientists who aren't Christians, who aren't believers. So that has to be acknowledged. But I think that it's just way too easy to say, well, science disproves religion. I think I would just challenge person, hey, lad, let's have a conversation about that. Why don't you give me something you think I should read, and I can give you something I think you should read, and we get back together and talk about it. And then I'd say Ross Douthat's book would be a good choice for the believer on that one.
Awesome. Yeah, science and religion. I feel like it probably isn't the best case against religion, especially God, because you can't really disprove him, I guess.
Well, and in fact, I mean, so if you have someone who's an atheist, the atheist believes that God does not exist. It's a positive claim. There is no God. And when I run into that, I don't run into that a lot teaching at Calvin because it's a Christian school. But I think the agnostic position is a little stronger because the atheist has to believe the claim there is in all of existence throughout the entire realm of the cosmos. I'm confident, I'm sure, I'm making a statement. There is no such thing as a God in all of that reality, which in order to make that claim, you're resting on the idea that you know that, which is a form of omniscience, that you, little human being, can claim this whole thing has no God. And ironically, omniscience is one of the characteristics that theists believe God has. So far, I think far more defensible is to say, I don't quite think that the case for God has been proven. The agnostic claim, I think, is more defensible. I don't think it's right, obviously, but it's I think more modest than the strong atheist claim, hey, there can't be a God, there is no God. The degree of knowledge that claim rests on is itself pretty hubristic, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think it is convenient to be agnostic at all? And with agnosticism, obviously you can, stay in this state of like, I don't really know, but you could just be like, oh, I'm, instead of an atheist, we're saying there's no God. I don't know, but I also don't do anything towards that. So then in that case, I mean, what exactly are you? And then, is there any convenience with agnosticism?
I think there can be. Now, do I think that there are some people who are honestly looking into this? So this is one of the great questions. Is there a God? Right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a God? And if so, does God care about me? Right? And now, are there people who are genuinely asking that question and who at this moment are in the agnostic place? I don't see why not. So I don't want to try to read anyone's mind or heart and say that someone can't honestly be in a season where they are agnostic about the existence of God. Now, can it be convenient? It sure can be. Yeah. Because to say I'm agnostic means, well, there might be, and that can be comforting that this world has a meaning, that there might be something good after death. And I don't have to, like on the atheist side, at least that's the courage of your convictions. There's no meaning. We're just, food for worms when we die. And it's just a stark kind of Nietzschean staring into the abyss. I mean, at least you're putting yourself out there. There is a version of agnosticism that's sort of just a placeholder for, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to have to deal with this, if I really believe human beings are meaningless and life is meaningless and we're just, worm food. But then I also don't have to allow that if there is a God, he might demand something of me, right? So there is a convenience there where it's almost a functional atheism without the stark wrestling with our own cosmic insignificance. And I'm not going to say if someone's there or not, but I certainly can see why that would be tempting to kind of stay in that season. But someone who is really thinking this is a great question, it's important, I want to do my due diligence and figure out what I believe about this, and I'm going to read the atheists, I'm reading the agnostics, but I'm going to read the Christians too and see and try to wrestle. I have C.S. Lewis, I'm a big fan of his. He says that person is a lot closer to God than some religious people who are just going through the motions. And you almost use religion as a shield against God. So I have a great deal of admiration for someone who's genuinely searching after the truth and might find themselves in an agnostic season. But I think you're right that for others it can be very convenient.
Yeah. Moving towards your position at the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, as executive director, what kind of questions is the Institute most focused on right now?
Well, thanks for asking that. The Institute is there because of a man who was a professor at Calvin and then went on to serve in the U.S. Congress, named Paul Henry. And Paul Henry was evangelical Christian. He leaned conservative in his politics, but would not be afraid to go against his own party if he thought he needed to. One of the things that characterized his public service was he had convictions he believed in, but he interacted really well with folks who disagreed. And so that's one of the things at the Henry Institute we try and replicate in our programming, that we try and introduce students to, is the idea of figure out what you believe. We do want to emphasize certain things that we think are true, but then also figure out what it means to interact well with your neighbors and fellow citizens who might see things differently. So that includes things like natural law. My work with hopeful realism would be an extension of that. That includes, we have a student group that meets once a month to read another thinker who I think is great, is Abraham Kuyper. When we talk about Kuyper's views about what it means to be a faithful Christian in a pluralist society. So the Henry Institute is sponsoring reading groups. We're helping, or we're supporting scholars doing some research. A colleague of mine named Doug Copeman just co-authored a book with a Wheaton professor about civil religion in American democracy. We help bring in speakers. We recently helped host, this is kind of a funny story, but a member of the Dutch royal family came to Calvin, and I got to be involved with interviewing her about her work. So lots of things like that. In terms of the ideas, what does Christian faith look like? Being authentic and convictional, but also not knocking people over the head, right, with our beliefs, but not shrinking away from them either, given we live in, as you rightly pointed out, an increasingly secular society that's quite pluralistic.
Yeah. How do you think Christians should navigate political engagement in an area of intense polarization that we see now?
Yeah. It's going to depend a little bit on the particular Christian and where they're at. So I sometimes give talks at churches, and if people are involved in politics, that's going to be one level. There are some people, they might be a new mom who's staying home to take care of her babies, or a dad is taking on another job to support his family, and the bandwidth for getting really involved in something political is just not going to be there. So part of it depends on just one's station in life. But I do think Christians, the proper lens through which we as Christians can look at politics is, it's one way in which we can love our neighbor. Right. So the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, soul, and strength. The second, which is like it, is to love our neighbors. And when we are engaged in politics, whether that's writing our congressman or woman, whether it's involved with a local city thing, whether it's volunteering at a school literacy thing, or whether it's volunteering at a crisis pregnancy center to help women in tough situations be able to live well with their babies. All those things are a way of doing politics, and a way of loving neighbor. So I think the Christian we sometimes can make one of two mistakes. Christians can think, aha, politics is our instrument to, bring heaven to earth, and we can kind of take over. And I think that's a mistake. Another mistake, I think, is to say, oh, politics is so contested and dirty that we need to keep our hands clean and we need to stay out of the political. And there are some, we do have some Christian traditions that kind of, get away from politics. So I'm not denigrating them, but I do think the better Christian approach is to say we are to be in but not of the world. We don't try and dominate. We don't escape. We engage. And I think engagement is a good posture for us to have thinking about politics.
Yeah. Yeah, specifically, I guess with our now so polarized nature, it's kind of hard to gauge how much you should be in or out, contributing or not. Especially that's kind of a question for me. Trying to go into like the political field. How much do I talk about? Because, obviously if you're a Christian, you should, from time to time talk about your faith. And if you're going into politics, if you talk about your faith, this is like a political, I guess it's just political strategy of, if you talk about your faith too much, people may, is that your dog behind you? Oh my gosh.
It is, yeah, that is both of them came up and he's the one who's sticking around. So,
I guess like you trying to gauge how much you should bring that in. How do you think your Christian belief impacts your politics? I mean, obviously, like I would assume, like socially, that it would definitely make sense that it would, change how you think.
yeah.
But how do you like speak about what you believe in politics, in a point to not push away people, to diverge the public? Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm saying that good enough.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm an armchair quarterback on this, or a backstreet driver, because I'm not in a position of political office. I do have several students who've gone on to do that, and you may be thinking about that. I mean, you're in DC right now, right? Engaged in politics to some extent. So here, I think again, I want to say it might your mileage might vary, might differ on the situation. It certainly will differ on the situation. But again, we almost here have the Goldilocks thing, or the Aristotle thing, if you like, between too much or not enough, right? Goldilocks, the bed was too hard or too soft and we wanted just right, or the porridge was too hot or too cold and she wanted just right. One thing I would caution against is thinking that what it means to be faithfully Christian is to kind of inject that in every moment possible. So think about like the quarterback or the athlete who's interviewed at the end of a game and they've done really well, and the first thing they say is, "I want to give thanks to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." I have no problem with that in that moment for that athlete. But if in every single interview they kind of do that, or if they bring it up all the time and they never actually talk about the game, that strikes me as almost too much, right? So if in politics one is never doing the hard work of, here's what the policy should be for our traffic situation here in Grand Rapids where I live, and here's the studies. If I'm always inserting, this is what God would want us to do, I don't know that's all that helpful. At the same time, if you're a Christian in politics, there's going to be moments where that's going to come up. It might come up socially, like the things that you might not be saying or doing, or there might be shortcuts that the norm would be, of course, you take that shortcut and you say as a Christian, I'm sorry, I can't say that. I can't misrepresent that, even if it would be politically helpful. So I would say that there's an overdoing it and there's an underdoing it. And the trick would be to find out what it looks like, to hit that just right spot. It's going to depend on who one's working with and for. I suspect, given the nature of the political world, that if a young person or mid-career or whatever is a faithful Christian, the moments are going to find you where you're going to realize I really can't do that, or I need to do this, and that's going to be weird. People are going to think I'm weird to do that in a faith thing. And there's going to be, sorry, I can't do that on Sunday morning. I'm at Capitol Hill Baptist, in DC, or I'm going to church, or so I do think your life, the Christian's life, we want to live for God and be involved in our church and faithful lives. And that's the goal. And then that's going to trickle down to having some effects in our job. And in the political world, I think that you have to decide very quickly, what you're going to say. Okay, on that I can be flexible on, but here's this line I can't cross. And if you remember, one of the things we read when we had that seminar together with Witherspoon was that the piece by C.S. Lewis about the inner ring. And so anyone can Google C.S. Lewis inner ring, and you'll find that essay. And it's, I think, a brilliant meditation on how a person who's still a pretty good person can be so tempted by the desire to be in. They can start taking steps that don't appear bad at first, but will take them to a pretty bad place over time. So I would recommend that for folks who are wrestling with this question.
Great. With artificial intelligence and AI becoming the next biggest thing, it feels like the big talk, and almost rightfully so. AI is reshaping economics, labor, warfare. How do you think political philosophy is keeping up or failing to keep up with that shift with AI?
I think the jury is still out. I think there's a range of responses. No doubt there are some. There are some who are, I think, welcoming AI and perhaps too enthusiastic about what it can do. There may be some others that are too skeptical or are alarmist. My temptation, in part because of what I do in trying to grade papers, and because I know how easy it is to avail oneself of what AI can do, my temptation is to be too alarmist, probably, if I'm trying to be honest. I think we'll have to see. The political philosophy, and when it's done well, is asking questions but also trying to figure out answers and then building on those answers. AI, it's unclear. The folks who are really into it seem pretty persuaded this could be another industrial revolution size shift. As a Christian, as someone who does political philosophy, I do think there are some givens about human nature. I think that human beings are valuable. We're also fallen. We're sinful. And AI, as with every other massive technological advance that we've had, will do some good things and will also be exploited in some pretty terrible ways. My short answer, if I'm being honest, is I'm not sure yet. I don't know that we have enough to go on, but I'm still confident in some of those bedrock convictions that my faith and that the intellectual tradition I'm a part of has said are true for thousands of years. I don't think AI is going to change those truths. It will change how those truths manifest and mix it up in society, and we do well to pay attention to it and try to do the best we can in grappling with what it means.
Yeah. And then another, pretty contentious issue is the issue of immigration. How do you think Christians should think about immigration policy? Where does natural law or Christian ethics push back against purely nationalist frameworks?
Yeah, so I think that natural law thinking and Christian ethics can give us some categories within which to have a good conversation. I don't think it's going to be like a formula where you plug in, here's this part of the issue, another part of the issue, here's some numbers, and it's going to spit out the one shiny golden public policy answer. We should let in X number of immigrants per year from these parts of the world with these skills or things like that. So what I think natural law reasoning can do is it can give us a way to weigh different goods that sometimes can be complementary, but sometimes they do have a tension or they can compete. So with immigration, some of the different goods, you've got the good of security. Every nation has to care about its borders. Excuse me. You've got the good of a culture that has an identity and a core. And there's, I think, a legitimate concern that if immigration is so overwhelming, might be concern that you change your culture in a way that may or may not be healthy. You also have the good of fresh blood, put it bluntly, and the story of the United States is a story of people coming from other places and making their home here and contributing in incredible ways. We also have the good, or at least the issue we've already mentioned, which is demographics. If you're not reproducing enough with babies, it might be good to have some people coming to join your community. So I think from a Christian point of view, natural law point of view, human beings are valuable. They're intrinsically valuable. They should not be seen as intrinsically as threats or as economic pawns to do the jobs we won't do. Right? There's certain ways that we can look at human beings that are a little bit reductionist. I think we want to avoid that. But I don't know that it's going to, like I said, it's not going to come up with one answer. My own kind of spitballing approaches. I'm in favor of legal immigration. I think that we should be pretty tough on illegal immigration, and I think we should have a more open posture towards legal immigration for all sorts of reasons from all sorts of places. I think the promise of the United States has been that what it means to be an American is not your religion per se, or the way you look, or the language you speak. The glue that holds us together are the promises or the ideas that we see in the Declaration of Independence, and that there can be a open but disciplined process whereby we could welcome more people from around the world.
Yeah. That's very interesting with immigration. I think it's very easy for people to be full one side or full another side, and it's almost like blindly like, hey, we want open borders, we're fine with illegal immigrants. Or on the other side, we don't want anybody in. And it's,
right.
You kind of have to gauge that. And I think that's another problem with the political polarization, where there's not even a sort of rationale behind that. It's almost like this is kind of where my political belief is pushing, and then this is like the far left or the far right idea. And is that even? And I think when you apply the natural law, or just there's some reasoning behind that, then you can figure out a more realistic approach to immigration. You talked about obviously you're a professor and your students. I assume there have been students who use AI. How do you deal with usage of AI at Calvin University?
So, I mean, among my colleagues, there's going to be a range of approaches, and I would take the moment to highlight we're hosting a conference in October on AI that I think will be really good. And one of my colleagues is a computer scientist. His name's Derek Sherman, but he also studies theology and culture, and he's putting this together. We're having a bunch of different speakers, including the Vatican's top AI thinker is going to be there. We're going to have a number of anyway. So I would just plug that as a place to think about this. So for me personally, I've gone to Blue Books for some writing, and that's been okay. The downside is it used to be I'd give students like 10 days to write a 5 or 6 page paper, and they'd turn it on Word, and then I would get it and I would edit it and put in comments. But my handwriting is terrible, but I could type, all right. And then I would be able to have a really good back and forth with a student about their writing, and you can't really do that with Blue Books. So that's been a loss, and I'm trying to figure out how I can try and recapture that. The problem is, in a class with 15, 20, 25 students, the temptation to let AI do your thinking for you or do part of your thinking for you is just overwhelming. And you can't, it's hard to prove, but you kind of can know it when you see it. So it's really been kind of depressing. And I haven't quite figured out the solution with what to do there yet. But the temporary solution I've been going with is Blue Books, asking students a question. They have to write it in their own handwriting. I've got to decipher it. But what the loss there is, I don't really get to work with them on the writing. The one exception is I teach in a prison. Calvin has a prison program, which is fantastic. I've written about that in public discourse. And in prison, my students there don't have AI. So I get to relive the glory days a little bit in prison of all places.
That's very interesting. Yeah, in prison that don't have any AI there. But would you ever catch students using AI? Like, was that ever a problem?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When it first came out, I had a student write a paper and he cited something from our author that we had never read, which was a pretty big red flag. And then I just called him out and he said, yeah, so sometimes students will they'll just admit it. Last year I co-taught a class. This was the PPE capstone. And those, for that class, because I co-teach, I don't do blue books. We actually have students write it up on Word. And we have some, big papers. And every time we had one or two students that both of us, my colleague and I, were reading. I was like, yeah, this doesn't look quite right. And when we brought them in to talk about it, they were conscientious, said, yeah, I did use this. And then we had a conversation. There may be some students who've used it and I didn't catch it, right? I'm not omniscient, unlike our atheist friends who claim to be omniscient. Yeah, it's, it is there, and we're human, right? So if you're a student and you've got 4 things due the next day and your pet at home just died and your girlfriend broke up with you and you're miserable and like, I gotta get this done. People take shortcuts. And so we got to figure out how to be there for our students and challenge them in a healthy way to be better than that, but also recognize, we're fallen. People are gonna make mistakes.
Yeah. With AI, it's like the hallucinations with the grabbing research from random things. That also messes with the concept of what we're seeing out in the social media, the concept of truth itself. It seems like the concept of truth itself is contested in modern politics. How do you teach your students to navigate a world of misinformation and epistemic fragmentation? Because I feel like, if there's all this around where it's like, oh, that really was just a kind of a headline that was partially true just to get more people to click on it, and you take that as something is true for yourself because you want to have trust in media organizations, and like how do you navigate a world of misinformation? And maybe it's not a world of misinformation, but it definitely is out there where you have skewed things that you're seeing.
Yeah, no, I think a world of misinformation is a great description, and we don't want to say that it was ever crystal perfectly clear. The Apostle Paul says we see through a glass darkly. So, and that's interesting because it implies we don't see perfectly, but it also implies we do see, right? We're not completely blind. And if you think about, Plato's allegory of the cave, and this idea that we're seeing these shadow puppets on the wall. There's nothing wrong with shadow puppets unless you don't realize that they're shadow puppets, right? If you think that's the whole, that's reality. So when it comes to, not just my students, myself, right? I think one difference between when I grew up in our country was we had 3 or 4 channels. People kind of trusted the news. There certainly wasn't, it certainly had a bias to it. There's no such thing as completely unbiased news. But the proliferation of sources now, with news sites, with things on the internet, with what we know to be intentional misinformation campaigns, even by foreign governments, people putting things out there. It is a sort of wild, wild west environment, and we have to have practices that will not promise 100% objective truth, but closer to that than just surrendering to the algorithms. Okay. So one of the things that I try to do myself, and I would encourage my students, is don't feel like you have to respond if something happens immediately. You've got to get your tweet or your Instagram out, or for my generation, Facebook. Sometimes it's good to wait a minute and see what's going on with something. The other thing is we all have our priors or our preconceived categories, like if we're conservative or liberal, whatever, such that if we hear a story that confirms those priors, like say something on government overspending for conservatives like me. Aha, that must be true. Well, maybe, or maybe not. And so I encourage my students, whether they're liberal or conservative, check your priors and just make sure that you're not agreeing with something just because it scratches that itch you already have of what you want to believe to be true. Same thing goes with emails that we sometimes get. There's an email, I'm not going to be able to do it off of memory, but it was basically started, I think, with maybe Al Gore in the 2000s or maybe even before that. It said, this presidential candidate was asked about his favorite Bible verse, and he said, John 16:3, and John 16:3 is something like Jesus wept or something like that. It's not a very good verse to have. And the meaning there, of course, is, well, what he really meant to say was John 3:16. And so the email goes around, and the purpose of the email is to make the candidate look stupid and ignorant about the Bible. Well, the funny thing is that same email got reused for candidates of both parties for years, right? It would just swap out the name. So we want to have not fully skeptical or cynical, but a cautious eye with claims that we hear, which I think helps. And the other thing is mix up your news feed, right? So don't just click on or watch Fox News, but check out CNN. Don't just read the New York Times, but also the Wall Street Journal. If you're a conservative, Public Discourse, which is the journal of the Witherspoon Institute, I think is a great resource. And then, maintain friendships with people who think differently from you, preferably those who act in good faith, right? So I have some liberal colleagues and some progressive colleagues who will acknowledge some weaknesses, right? And and those are the folks I want to have conversations with. The last thing I'll say is, in trying to figure out someone's integrity on this, there's two tests that are important. One is, are they willing to be critical of the folks on their own side, right? Or will they never do that? Can they say, yeah, this person's in my party or at my side, and yet he or she could have done better? That's one. And two, are they willing to acknowledge a good point by the other side or something true from the other side? Like, I don't agree with this person on this side or the other, but so I'll give you an example. AOC, whose politics I find, really off. She has been critical of the growth of gambling and advertising for gambling and online gambling. I was like, I think she's right. I'm really so I need to say, if I have integrity, I don't agree with her on a lot of things, but boy, I think she's right about this. I think those are two good tests. Will they criticize their own side, and will they give credit to the other side?
Yeah. And to finish up, because I want to respect your time, I have one last question about C.S. Lewis, because you mentioned C.S. Lewis a bit. And obviously, as you've read and researched C.S. Lewis, what has surprised you the most? How did your interest in C.S. Lewis's political thought develop? And what's some good reads of C.S. Lewis and some good ideas from C.S. Lewis we can bring with us as we conclude this?
Yeah. All right. So a few different things there. Like a lot of people who may have grown up in Christian homes, I first encountered Lewis with my parents reading me the Chronicles of Narnia, so The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and those things. When I was in middle school, I read Mere Christianity, which was a book. It was originally a series of radio addresses he did during World War II for the BBC, basically laying out why he thinks Christianity makes sense. And that was meaningful for me because it helped me make that transition from just my faith was from my parents to, oh, here's this guy who's saying what my parents say, but he says a different, a little different accent, and it makes sense to me. And then when I went to Baylor for my master's, I was able to write a thesis on Lewis, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh, I get to actually write on Lewis for school, which is cool. So that's probably where it got started. Lewis, in terms of his politics, he was the conventional wisdom about him was that he did not care about politics at all and disliked politics. And he certainly disliked aspects of politics. That's definitely right. The idea that he didn't care about politics is just completely wrong. He definitely cared about politics. And if we understand politics as more than just, hey, how does this vote work or how does this policy work, but what is good for the polis? What is good for the city? What does human flourishing look like? And he's definitely, I think, a great thinker about politics. What was surprising? one thing that was surprising was he's a massive fan of Plato and of Aristotle. He's a Platonist. He's an Aristotelian. Read them in the original language, and they deeply influence his thought. And yet he disagrees with their politics. He's a democracy guy, and that was interesting for me to learn. And the reason he's a democracy guy is because he believes in the fall. And neither Plato nor Aristotle really believed in the fall in the same way that the Christian doctrine of original sin teaches. So that was surprising to me to learn about how he still incorporates Platonic and Aristotelian insights into who we are as human beings, but it's tempered by a very robust belief in the Christian doctrine of original sin, such that we should not expect too much out of our politics. Original sin is gonna keep it from accomplishing too much. So that was something that was surprising. You asked about what I would recommend. Was that another?
Yes.
So it might depend if someone's more interested in logic and apologetics, then I might recommend Mere Christianity as an opening. And then The Abolition of Man is a little more higher. It's going to be more of engagement of a little tougher to read, but really good on the logical level about natural law and about philosophy. If one is more into literature and kind of the imagination, The Great Divorce is a lot of fun. It's a story. It's Lewis imagining what it'd be like to travel down to hell and then take a bus to heaven. There's also, if you like science fiction, he wrote a trilogy that's science fiction. First one's Out of the Silent Planet, and the second one's called Paralandra, and the third one is That Hideous Strength. And if you like mythology, he rewrote the Cupid myth in a book called Till We Have Faces, and very few people read that, but it was one of his favorite books. So those would be some different suggestions. If you like the logic stuff, then Abolition of Man, Mere Christianity, Miracles would be another one. If you like sci-fi, the sci-fi trilogy. If you like mythology, Till We Have Faces. Screwtape Letters is a favorite. And if you want to listen to that, you can. John Cleese, the great Monty Python comic comedian actor, he does a rendition of it, and it's quite good. So those would all be fun entry points into the world of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. No, yeah, I did read the Screwtape Letters and some other things from Witherspoon. Like I think we did reading during wartime.
Oh, also good. Yeah, he got a ton of essays too. So yeah, lots of different fun things to read about those.
Yes, and one last thing, because I think it'd be a fun one to end on. The progression of the style of your beard. I noticed in some older photos, it used to be longer. Then I mean, the beard is awesome. I don't really have a question. What is the progression of your beard up to now?
So one of my favorite, we get student comments on our evaluations from class, and a number of years ago I was teaching at a different place. One of the comments said something nice about me, but then talked about my sentient beard. So I've always appreciated that from a former student. It's getting a bit bushy at the moment, so I got to trim it down. I used to have what you probably remember. I had a goatee, right?
Yeah.
I had a goatee for a number of years. I would love to say I've got some great philosophical or religious reason for that. It's probably just the Freudians would say I'm compensating for losing my hair up here, right? So when I was your age and in college, I was California, and I had a big mop of surfer hair that would come down to here. So that's probably all it is. It does make things complicated when you're eating, to put a silly human touch on it. You got to make sure you're not leaving anything in there. But yeah, it's it is what it is. I am not tempted to make too much of my own appearance for what gives my life value. So in that sense, my appearance is helpful in a humility way.